Hi there, and welcome back to the Mixing Tips series. And today's video is going to be part one of possibly a 2 or 3 part short series within this series on compression. And we are going to be focusing most of our attention on this little guy here, the Studio One compressor. Now, within Studio One, there are a few other compressors. Some of them are part of channel strips, like the compressor within the basic Studio One channel strip, which is just a one knob compressor with 3 different speeds. Very, very simple to use. You just basically just turn this up and it gives you a percentage, and it's either fast, medium or slow. And we'll talk about speeds and that kind of thing in just a minute, what that all means. We also have a slightly more advanced channel strip in the shape of this guy. This is the fat channel, and with this compressor you have a bit more of the standard controls that you would see on a compressor, where you'd have ratio, threshold, makeup gain, attack and release. I'll talk about what all of that means in just a minute. But this has EQ and a gate. Gate is a kind of compressor as well, but it works a little bit differently. We will look at that in a future video. And also, if you have the channel strip collection from the Presonus shop, there are some other channel strips like this one here, which is the RC500. And this is a fixed ratio compressor, so there's no ratio knob, but you do get threshold and attack and release. But you don't get any numbers on this, so you kind of have to use your ears a bit to discern how fast or how slow you're setting your attack and release. So this is really great to get into once you've got a good grasp of how this all works here, and what 15 milliseconds or 120 milliseconds on your attack and release sound like. And you're getting good at this attack and release business, then yes, you can certainly move on to something like the RC500 or this one, the VT1, which gives you the more standard controls. This one has a variable ratio, threshold, again release and attack and release without the numbers, and this little gain knob down here. So we are going to focus our attention on this guy, because this is kind of like the basic compressor. Okay, so for those of you that don't know what compression is or what it does at all, we're going to cover that in this video. That's the focus. So we have ratio, threshold, attack, release and gain on this compressor. Now the ratio, which defaults to 2:1, basically tells the compressor how much it is going to compress the audio. By compress, I mean turn down, which is what we mean by compression. We mean to turn the volume down. Essentially, a compressor is a very, very smart volume controller. It's like a little guy inside your mixer with his finger on the fader. And basically, you need to give him a set of instructions so he knows when to turn that fader down and when to turn it back up, and how much, and how fast, and how slow to do the turning up and turning down. So that's what the compressor essentially does. So the ratio here, this tells you how much the compressor needs to compress. 2:1 is very light, but it'll also go up to, this one will go up to 20:1, which is very heavy compression. I will now explain what I mean by ratio in this particular case. What this means in the case of 2:1 is that for every 2 dB over the threshold, the compressor will turn that down to 1 over threshold. So if I was to turn this up to 9.2:1, then that would mean that the compressor would turn the volume down by 9.2 dBs over the threshold. It would turn that down to 1 over the threshold. Okay, So the more the bigger this number is, the heavier the compression. The smaller this number is, the lighter the compression will be. And the great thing about the compressor is all of these knobs work together in tandem. So sometimes you can have a high ratio and a low threshold, but the way you set the attack and the release can give you the same amount of gain reduction as having these set differently. So you can arrive at the same amount of gain reduction, which is what we mean by compression. When we're compressing, we are reducing the gain, and this meter here tells you how much you're reducing that gain. And then that will lead you to a decision on how much you are going to turn this up, which will be your makeup gain. Because we are reducing gain here, we now want to make that up. And when we make that up, that brings the quieter sounds of your audio up to kind of meet a little bit more the louder sounds. So it evens it out. That's the goal of compression, to even out loud and soft. So that you can park your audio in the mix and not need to keep on adjusting it all the time. Okay, so we've talked about ratio, we've talked about threshold, and we've talked about the gain a little bit. Now, for most people, the big confusion is right here. Attack and release. When you're first starting out, you don't know how to set these, and it can be a little bit confusing. So, the attack is basically how fast all of this takes place. How fast the audio gets turned down by the amount of the threshold. Okay? And it's measured in milliseconds in this particular compressor. So that's to do with how fast or how slow the audio gets turned down when it crosses the threshold by this ratio. Release is how fast or how slow the audio is returned to its original level when it came into the compressor in the first place. So in this instance, it's defaulted to 120 milliseconds. So relatively slow. 15 milliseconds on the attack. Relatively-ish. Medium-ish, just over medium. And then your makeup gain, you would make up the difference with your gain reduction here. So that's how these all work. Now at the moment I've got the threshold set to 0. What I'm going to do is I'm going to solo this track here. I'm going to turn that one off and that one off. So the only one I've got going is the compressor. And I'm going to solo this, and I'm going to pull this threshold back until we see some gain reduction going on here. So we're going to get to see some compression in action. So as you can see, the more I pull that threshold back, the more we get gain reduction. In that case, minus 6.7 dB. So that's quite a lot of gain reduction. I could just keep pulling this back, and now we're absolutely squashing the living daylights out of this. See, now we're getting nearly minus 20 dB. So we're actually smashing the volume down by 20 dB practically by turning that all the way across. Yeah, that's probably a little bit too much. Okay, so we're not going to do that. Now that we've heard the drums and we've pulled this threshold back, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I think in terms of attack and release. I don't like to get too technical. I'm not really that kind of a guy. So I like to think of attack in terms of amount of punch. And what I mean by punch is how much of the audio I like to let through before the compressor starts reducing that volume. So in the case of drums, more often than not, I like to have plenty of punch. I like my drums to have a good amount of smack to them, a good amount of impact. So let me demonstrate that a little bit right here with this drum loop. Now that we've got the threshold set, and we've got a couple of dB going on here, I'm going to pull this back. Now we're getting a lot more compression now. So we're getting a lot more compression now, but can you hear, now that I have the attack set at the fastest setting, suddenly a lot of the real impact of the drums is gone. Because the compressor is compressing the very beginning of the audio, the very beginning initial sound of the audio that we call the transient is being reduced by quite a lot, by 8 dB. So a lot of the impact of the drums is gone. So what I want to do is I want to pull this back up and see if we can get some more punch going. So the more I open this attack up, the more transient is going through before the compressor starts doing its thing, starts reducing. So we're still getting a lot of gain reduction. And we've now got this round about a medium-ish attack, 6 milliseconds. So what I want the compressor to do is I want the compressor to release the audio kind of before the next sound happens. Now, given that we're dealing with drums, and we're dealing with drums at 105 beats a minute, that's going to be quite tricky to sort out. And at the moment we have it at 120 milliseconds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this back until this starts to sound a bit more natural sounding. So I now have it set at the fastest setting, and the drums sound a bit more clearer, a bit more snappy. Particularly that snare drum sounds really quite snappy now. And so that's kind of how I like to have my drums set up, with the release not very slow. In fact, I have it on the fastest setting. So for drums, I will tend to have the release pretty fast, unless I'm dealing with something like a slow ballad with brushes. Then maybe I will open up this release a little bit more. But for the most part, for something like a particularly funky, busy pattern like this, I want the release to be fast. So if I refer to the attack in terms of punch, I think of the release in terms of it being like a tone control. So the more I open this up, the longer the compressor is holding on to the audio before releasing it. So there is a sense to which you can hear more sustain with a slower release. But if you set the release too slow, then the compressor is releasing the audio, and then the next sound is coming through whilst it's still releasing. So you end up with something that's a little bit like double compression. You end up compressing what's kind of not fully been released yet, and then compressing. And that's when you get kind of like a pumping effect. Now, for certain styles of music, that pumping effect is desired, but for most popular song styles, yeah, you probably don't want that kind of pumping effect. Certainly not for the music that I tend to work in, which is kind of more jazz and funk orientated. I don't want that. So I tend to have the release set fast. Okay, so if attack is punch and release is sustain, there is another effect that compression has, particularly when you are mixing your audio and you're blending your tracks together. And that is that with a fast attack, so the transient, that initial part of the sound is being reduced quickly by the compressor. It's being grabbed quickly. That tends to give the effect of the audio being pushed back in the mix somewhat. And a slower attack, has the opposite effect. It allows more transient through, which means more of the initial signal is coming through before the compressor is compressing. So what that does is that has a tendency to make the sound like it is much more forward. This is good for things like a lead vocal, or for the snare drum, or the kick drum, because those are the kind of things that you want nice and upfront and present in a popular song, particularly a rock song or pop music. Yes, you want that. But certain other elements, like perhaps backing vocals, you would probably want the opposite effect. You want them to sit back a little bit more in the mix, and you can control that with a faster attack. So there we go. We have a bit of an overview of compression. We've done a little bit of compression in action. Next video, we will do a lot more compression in action, and we will look at some of these other compressors that we have available to us that I've briefly shown you here. So until next time, cheers for now.